Hello, everyone. Welcome. Give people a couple of moments to cycle in. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Just a couple more moments, and then we're going to kick things off. All right, it's 11:01. We're going to be prompt here. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to be talking all about Zingerman's recipe for effective organizational change, which we call bottom line change. My name is Katie Alexander. I am ZingTrain's community builder, and I'm going to be your host today. And I'm thrilled to be here alongside our longest tenured ZingTrain trainer, Elmian Gilbert. We also have Mara Ferguson, who is the keynote liaison here at ZingTrain. Behind the scenes, she's monitoring the chat and questions with me. We are all coming to you live from Ann Arbor, Michigan, in different pockets of ZingTrain this morning. And we'd love to hear where all of you are coming from as well. Feel free to drop your location in the chat, which you can find along the bottom row of your Zoom screen. And if you find that you have some neighbors, please say hey to them. As far as the format, sorry, I have a couple more things. We're going to dive into the good stuff, just a few helpful tips to make the most of our time here. As far as the format of the webinar, Elmian is going to be taking center stage and presenting on bottom line change for a bit. And then we have some time reserved at the end for question and answer. So we're going to be collecting questions in the question and answer section of Zoom. So please do submit any and all questions that you have throughout the webinar, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. If we are not able to address the questions, we'll do our best to give resources and some answers in the follow-up email that you will be receiving after this webinar. There's also closed captioning available through Zoom. And if you would like to turn that on, Mara's going to drop some details into the chat so that you can access that feature. And then the last item of business is you may see that we are recording today's session. And so we'll be sending out the recording in the follow-up email. And it will also live on zingtrain.com in our library of resources, where we have many more webinars and blog posts and lots of other free, fun, helpful resources there too. So that's all for me. And I'll be back at the end to help facilitate Q&A, but I'll turn things over to Elmian.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today to talk about change. As Katie said, my name is Elmian. I'm one of the trainers here at ZingTrain. I've been a part of the Zingerman's organization for over 16 years. And I would say that bottom line training is one of the most impactful things I've learned over my tenure here. So let's start getting into it. I'm going to start showing some slides here. There we go. Okay. Okay, excellent. Let's get into it. So we asked you in the webinar invite to let us know, to answer a couple of questions that were really, really helpful for us. So thank you for doing that. One of the questions that we asked was, what is your relationship with change? Well, the results were a little bit of a surprise. And the biggest part of this pie chart here was I understand it's necessary, but I don't always love it, with a little bit over 50% of you answering that way. I'm in this camp too, although I also identify with one of the smaller vote getters, which was that I like it when it's my idea, which was smaller than I expected with only 13%. Unsurprisingly, the I love it camp is pretty big with 35%, but then the people who are going to choose to attend a webinar about change are almost certainly going to have more positive feelings about change. Which relates to the little teeny tiny piece of the pie there. These are the folks who admitted no thanks, was their relationship with change. It was too small to even get a label, and that was only 1.4% of the total. So I thought, when we hear from you, I think it's really helpful to tell you what we are talking about here, or to report back to you. The other two questions, I'm going to share some of your thoughts as we get into kind of the pertinent sections. It's really interesting seeing the themes, the very clear themes that emerged from what you shared. What I want to highlight here about this chart too, before we move away from it, is that just as there is kind of a mix of different feelings and emotions and perspectives on change here in the webinar attendees, that is almost certainly true in your organization as well. So for those, particularly for those who love change, it can be really helpful just to keep in mind that not everyone shares your warm feelings. So in fact, we have a graph that often describes what tends to happen when you're the change leader. So you as the change leader are the pencil in this graph. When you're leading change, you're going through all of the emotions and the angst and the consternation about making the change, right? This is you making up your mind that it'll be great. No, it'll never work. Oh, it'll be amazing. Everyone's going to hate it, right? You're going up and down and kind of working through all this stuff pretty much on your own. But then you make the decision, the change is going to happen and it's smooth sailing for you. Everything's cool. I've made the decision. We've made the change. What's the big deal? But everyone else was kind of smooth sailing before you make the change. And now they're going through all of that angst and consternation. Like, what is even happening here? Whose idea was this? Maybe it'll be okay. No, it'll never work. Right. So I imagine that many of you have had that happen to you before. And by having an effective change process, we really work to shift that model. So this is a graph that is representative of our change process. We call it bottom line change. Thank you, Mara. I think I said bottom line training. We're all going through the turmoil and the ups and downs of the change process together, right? As we go through this change process. And then once the time for implementation happens, then we're on the same page. And one of the things that I think is really important about this change process, I think it's helpful to understand, is that it may take longer for us to get to the point when the change happens, but once it does, it's almost always more effective and longer lasting, right? We're not just making change, we want to make effective change. We want to make sustainable change. So what I'm going to share with you over the course of our time together is our time-tested, proven tool for effectively leading a change from initial idea kind of through to full completion. And I want to say too, this works on changes of all different sizes. We have found that any change is made more effectively when we're following these different steps in our process. And one of the things, as I was learning this, right, I learned this many years ago, but continues to be helpful framing for me, is this model. It's called the effective change model. It came through experts in the field of organizational development to kind of describe the conditions that are necessary for effective change, right? And I think it's just a useful lens to view change through, frankly, not just even before change happens, but like at different points of the change process. So let's walk our way through it. So here, the D stands for dissatisfaction, right? In order for any change to happen, there needs to be some dissatisfaction with the way that things currently are, right? There could be a desire for something different, or there are desires for innovation or improvement, right? This can start with just your gut feeling, I think this could be better. So dissatisfaction is not negative, right? It just is. You can think of it as discontent, if that's a little that's a little softer wording. Where this is coming from though, innovation does not come from being okay with the status quo. All change comes from some kernel of dissatisfaction. So the next crucial element in this model is a V for vision. So what does it look like when the change has been made successfully, right? People are almost always more willing to go along with a change when they can picture what it's going to look like when the change has been made, right? And we're not talking like a pie in the sky, perfect utopia kind of vision here. We're talking about, we've already made the change. We've had to figure some stuff out, but we like it. It's working well for us. What does it look like in the current state, right? For us, visions are written in present tense. I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but what does it really look like when it's going well, or when it has happened the way that we were hoping for it to happen? The F is something that when we teach this in person, we don't ask people to guess because it's not as straightforward sometimes. The F stands for first steps. So we want to have some idea of how we're going to get started implementing the change, right? We might have this strong dissatisfaction or sense of wanting to change. We might even have a really clear picture of what we want it to look like on the other side, but without any action, no change will occur. I would also say too, that there are people who embrace change. They don't really worry as much about the first steps. They're like, okay, we need to change. We're going to figure it out. Let's go. Woo, woo, woo. People who are pragmatists like me, we need more information. It's not that I don't want the change to happen. It's more that like, I need to know that you've figured, or you know that some things are going to need to change, or we're going to need to maybe order something different. Like I need more kind of boots on the ground information than just the vision. So I often use an analogy. If anyone remembers the childhood game Candyland, for me, the vision is the candy castle, right? That's the goal at the end of the game. You're trying to move your piece all the way up to the candy castle. And the first steps function in the role or the first steps are like the peppermint forest, right? It is too chancy, or like, you can't figure out like every single step you're going to take because you're drawing cards, right? I played Candyland recently with my nephews. Like you don't know what's going to happen when you're pulling cards. You might have to go backwards. So going all the way out to the vision is too far sometimes. What I need is the kind of like, I need that first milestone to be able to stare it in the eye and say like, okay, I can see how like we start making this change and we can get to this first milestone, right? That really helps, I think, with people who are very pragmatic or might even be a little bit resistant to change. Well, speaking of resistance also, that is what the R stands for. You could probably guess it. It is, in fact, resistance. So whether we like it or not, without fail, resistance pops up as a result to any change, even the ones we thought were like so obvious that why would anyone even dream of opposing this? Like, it's just going to be such a good change. But like dissatisfaction, resistance is not a bad thing. And, thinking about this as a true algebraic formula here, if the resistance is 0, no change is going to happen, right? So resistance can take the form of apathy there or inertia. And it really, resistance takes different forms. This was a really clear trend in your responses as well. I mean, it was a little heartbreaking to read all the different ways that people have like presented resistance. Some of the themes were anger, frustration, fear, right, of what's going to be different. Then there's the mentalities of, though, that's how it's always been done, or if it's not broke, don't fix it. A resistance can come in the form of a lack of buy-in or even sabotage. Woof, those were some really rough examples that you shared. One thing I want to state clearly here, though, is that the formula does not say not to have resistance. It just means resistance needs to exist in order to have effective change. So if you don't have resistance, right, you have apathy or you have compliance, where people are going to go along with a change for a little while and then revert right back to their old behavior, right? True, lasting, sustainable organizational change can take up to 2 years, right? I mean, I don't know that anyone is super enthusiastic about hearing that. I mean, different changes take different amounts of time, but I think it's really helpful to realize that in the resistance, that this is natural, this is okay, and at least they're expressing it to me, because then I can do something with that information. And once we start to outweigh the resistance, we can start to get to change that will really stick. So I'm a visual person. I found this to be really helpful. This made it really click for me. So the model on the left here, it depicts ineffective change, right? Because the resistance is outweighing the total value of the dissatisfaction, the vision, and the first steps. So in order to get to effective change, we need to start tipping that fulcrum, right? We need to change the balance. And one of the things we've learned the hard way is that if you tackle resistance directly, you only get more resistance, right? People tend to dig in and they get entrenched. So instead of focusing directly on the resistance, can we have now maybe shared dissatisfaction? So I was the one who saw that we wanted something to change. Now I'm going to see if I can get other people on board. Like, let me go from having a gut feeling to thinking about, okay, well, but why, right? Can I state it more clearly so that other people understand that there is the possibility for something to get better? Can I improve my vision? Can I make it more clear? Can I make it more compelling for people? Can I make it more kind of exciting and inspiring? And then maybe I need to modify my first steps. Maybe they aren't clear enough for the people that are like a little bit on the fence, right? All of that work is going to start to outweigh the total resistance. And this this process that we're going to share with you, bottom line change, is our organizational change process that has steps that are designed to help with outweighing resistance, right? And it doesn't talk about tackling resistance directly, but it is about kind of like creating the other pieces of this formula. Bottom line change, as we define it, is a simple, clear, exceptionally effective practice for creating change, whether it's large or small, in any organization of any size. Because we're a food business, we call it a recipe. It's our favorite organizational recipe. And like any recipe, we want to start as we get into it by looking at the ingredients here. So the ingredients for a change project or a change that you want to implement, the first one is a pinch of an organization's time, right? Alluded this to a little bit already. If it is a simple change, like we want to change the position of the copier, we want to move where our office supplies are stored, that might not take a super long time. What I will guarantee though, is if you make the change without doing this kind of process, especially here at Zingerman's, when we've been practicing this for a long time, you increase the amount of resistance tenfold, right? Then you're going to spend all the time on the other side making up for the frustration, the anger, the fear that people are feeling because they weren't consulted about the change. If you go to them ahead of time and say, hey, I'd really like to move where the copier is, here are my compelling reasons, here's what it's going to look like on the other side, right? Then we might be able to make that change in a week, right? As opposed to maybe a month or 2 months or even longer of hurt feelings. A big change, like maybe rolling out an organizational vision, changing the way that you train, changing onboarding, might be something that takes a bigger amount of time and a bigger use of resources. The tasty dose of data, as I said before, the dissatisfaction can come from I think this could be better. This isn't working the way that I want to, but do a little bit more work there to come up with okay, but why? Are there trends in the industry that I can, find that are going to help me make this change more effectively? The right people to have involved in the process. It's not just the people that will be impacted by the change. We want to think a little bit more bigger and broader about that. Sometimes we want to consider our customers in the change process. It's not just our staff who are going to need to do something differently. It's our customers who are going to need to do something differently. Sometimes it's our vendors. Sometimes we want to get outside expertise. Trust in the process. And I think these two go really hand in hand. Trust in the process and a willingness to ask for help. What we have found is that this change process works when we do it. We might need to repeat a couple of steps before we're ready to move further on. But if we trust the process, we're going to get to that outcome that we're going for on the other side. And the willingness for help, Stash Kazmersky was a former managing partner of ZingTrain and the one who brought this change process to us as an organization. He was an organizational consultant. Really, taught us about harnessing the wisdom of the group, that multiple people putting their heads together is always going to result in a stronger outcome than one person trying to force a change through, right? So we think of this really truly as like any other kind of recipe. It's written down so that we can read it and we can reuse it regularly. And when we stick to the recipe, changes tend to turn out pretty well. Just like when we make any other kind of recipe, if we don't use the right ingredients, if we don't follow the recipe, we're not going to get the results that we want. So now that we know the ingredients, let's look at the procedure here, the steps to make effective change happen. So it's 5 steps. The first one is to get clear on what are our compelling reasons for making this change. In other words, why? Why do I want to make this change? Why is it going to be better on the other side? Then step 2 is to draft a positive vision of the future, right? So once the change has been made, and to get leadership support for the vision. In other words, what are we trying to create here? Let's get other people on board by sharing what that's going to be. Then we want to get people on board to create our microcosm to determine who else needs to know and how are we going to tell them. This is essentially creating our action plan. So who do we need to get involved here? Then we want to actually implement the change, right? Or get ready to create the action plan. And step 5 is to implement the change. So step 4, we'll talk more about this, but this is where we get a lot more people involved. We start going beyond just the first steps to having an entire action plan to roll things out. And then step 5, right? It's kind of the smallest step and we're going to spend the least amount of time on it because this work is front loaded. So once we actually implement the change, now we're just carrying out what we already said we were going to do. And I want to say too, one of the things we've learned is that most organizations change tends to happen in the reverse order, right? Someone's like, okay, we got to make this change, make the change. And then we're all like, wait, how are we supposed to make this change? And then who's supposed to be involved? Who's going to make the change? Is it me? Do you want me to also change? What are we supposed to be doing? And then finally, like, why are we doing this? Right? It would be so much more effective if we did this in the reverse order. And then when we finally get to the point of making the change, we're like, all those other questions are answered already. We're not asking them after the fact. So we're going to dive into each of these steps in a little bit more detail next. So step one, create a clear and compelling purpose for the change. This is starting with why, right? I mean, people always want to know why. We used to say that like little kids, I mean, they'll just ask why 1,000 times until their interest is satisfied. Adults are a little more hesitant to ask why, but they want to know. Why are you asking me to make this change? Why is it going to be better? So if we're asking someone to go through all the trouble of making change, like changing their behavior, or maybe even sometimes it might be a little bit more work, especially at first, they're going to need some really compelling reasons to get on board. So in this step, this is where we are collecting the data, and then we're going to share the data. We might share specific numbers so people understand what's going on. The data is ideally going to back up whatever change it is you're hoping to make. And to be clear, there are times when we start like looking for the data to back up a change, and we realize this isn't actually going to be an effective change because the data isn't bearing that out. It's like, no, you know what? It turns out customers are actually really happy with the way we're doing things, and like let's actually not change it. I thought this was going to be a great idea, but maybe not, right? The reason, I think the other piece is that we do want to have actually compelling changes, and they need to be compelling to the people that are going to be involved in this. So I'm going to talk about them. There's kind of two main components, right? So it's a compelling reason, but it's also who is your constituency? Who is this reason targeting, right? The compelling reasons, you know, even if the dissatisfaction is something negative, we frame it in the positive here. So the compelling reason is not like our new website stinks or our customers hate our website. Instead, we're going to say something like our new website will be easier for our customers to use. Customers are going to be more likely to find exactly what they're looking for. They'll be able to search for what they want. Or we can increase that shared dissatisfaction by saying a recent survey found that 4 out of our 10 customers were leaving our website because they couldn't find what they were looking for. Whoa, that's really compelling, right? I was like, oh gosh, okay, yeah, let's do a website change. I didn't realize it was that bad, right? By the way, these are not real. I'm not talking about anyone's website, including ours. We also want to then, the side point of that too, is to consider who are the reasons compelling to. Right. So we want to target the different constituencies or the different groups that are going to be impacted by the change. The reasons a frontline employee will find compelling are different than the reasons their manager will find compelling, or the accountant or the owner, right? And if you're the only person that finds the reasons extremely compelling, it's going to get really hard to bring other people on board. They're like, okay, I mean, right. If people are just like, I don't really see it, right? We need to have compelling reasons that make other people also want to make the change. I will also say that part of this work I think is really beneficial because it essentially forces you or allows you as the change leader to get really clear on the reasons for making this change so that when you get the inevitable resistance, right? And we already know there's going to be resistance. I'm better able to not defend the change, but be able to kind of acknowledge that, like, yeah, you know, I mean, I didn't know that this was an issue, but this is what we've heard from our customers, right? So that it's not just my gut feeling. And this is, to be clear, you don't always have to have data to back things up. Like, you know, our CEO, Ari Weinzweig, he's been running Zingerman's for over 40 years. Like his gut is really good at telling him sometimes that like things need to change or we need to have an evolution on something. So it's okay to have that. I also want to say too that the compelling reasons have become such a part of our language at Zingerman's. Like if someone even hints about making a change, like the first question someone's going to ask is like, well, what are the compelling reasons for making this change, right? And honestly, it works great out of work too. We will ask people, I've snuck in with my family, right? That they'll talk about wanting to do something. And I'm like, well, like, why do you want to do that? And I can ask it in a better way than that. But, you know, I remember my mom was a teacher and she would ask me to come in the summer and help her move around her classroom. I'd be like, okay, you know, what are the compelling reasons for making this change, right? I mean, I'm going to help her. It's my mom. She asked me to help. Of course, I'm going to help. But I'm more likely to get on board and do it gladly if I understand kind of the purpose why. So let's quickly look at an example. So this is one of a real bottom line change, or we call it BLC. They happened at Zingerman's a couple of years ago. So this was a change that was implemented by one of our fellow businesses on Zingerman's South Side, which is a campus of 4 businesses. 3 of them have production as well as some retail space. And part of what was really beneficial about this change project and doing a bottom line change for this was that part of the resistance was likely to come from one of the other Southside businesses who also sells salads, right? So if you're going to start selling salads, now there are 2 different places to buy them from. This might potentially cut into their sales. So communicating early on that they wanted to make this change and that they had some compelling reasons beyond just increased sales for the second business. It's a great way to get other people on board. As someone who then started buying the salads from Zingerman's Creamery, I found it very compelling, as a customer. But I think it was just really great to see the reasons why, right? They want to promote local produce. They want to use some of their existing products. So cheese, right? And they had, some other kind of like sides that would go with cheese that frankly make delicious toppings for a salad, right? So they don't have to be big earth-shattering reasons. So what is compelling to the people that are going to be impacted by the change, right? As we go forward, we're going to get into step 2. As we do this, we are going to, I'm definitely going to answer your questions, and I will come back to this example with when we get into the next step as well. So step 2 to bottom line change is 2-part, right? And I would say, honestly, if you only took away steps 1 and 2 from this change process, you're going to have more effective change. I mean, I would encourage you to use all 5, but if you're only going to use 2, use these 2. And step 2 is really made up of 2 important parts. One is to create a vision of what does it look like once the change has been made successfully, or to get, leadership agreement on the vision. So to write the vision, get leadership agreement. Often people hear when they're first learning this, right? I mean, anyone at Zingerman's can take, we have a 2.5-hour class on bottom line change. Anyone can start a change project, but if you don't get leadership agreement, it's not moving forward. So that's part of, I'll talk about kind of both parts of this. So a vision, as we define it, is, a picture of success, what success looks like at a particular point in time, written with enough richness of detail or specificity that we'll know when we've accomplished it. So here in the context of change, the vision is really helpful for painting a picture of how amazing or more productive or more pleasant things will be once we've actually made the change and the dust has settled. We don't need to get bogged down into how we're going to do it. That's not the purpose of the vision. The vision is about communicating what the change is going to look like on the other side, right? It could be a couple of paragraphs. It could even be for really small change sentences, but this is a really critical step in the process. And like with the compelling reasons, it can help get people past the resistance and bring them on board. So let's look at the same change for the Creamery to see their vision for this change, right? So it was written present tense as though it's already happening. So here the vision would have been written in March or April. It's going out to September with 5 months of experience in selling salads. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. You'll be able to see it in the slides later, but I want to add a highlight just here that it isn't that long. Right? So I said before, the change paragraph could be, or a change vision could be a paragraph or sentences, or even a page, depending on the scope of the change, right? But it's not that long. And the intent of it is just to kind of share this positive picture on the other side. The other piece of this, I think the Creamery would be really excited to sell 70 salads in a week. Their kind of competitor in the salad market here is selling a lot more than that. So I think that's another piece where the vision is helpful in saying, we're not coming for you. Like, we're not going to steal all of your business. We just want like a little bit of the slice of the pie, and we're going to offer something that's a little bit different than what you're already doing, right? They want to do things with more seasonality, which is not something that's offered in the other business. Okay, so let's talk about what makes for a great vision. Well, to start, we think it's crucial for a vision to be inspiring, right? Certainly you as the change leader should be inspired by it, and you want other people to be inspired too, right? You want them to be like, oh yes, I do want this to happen. And the flip side of that coin is that you also want that vision to be strategically sound. So it's a balancing act. There's no perfect balance of, like keeping it rooted in reality, but like also inspiring to get other people on board. I mean, if it's too strategically sound, well, then that's not really that meaningful, and you may not get the buy-in that you want. If it's too inspiring, then people are they're gonna opt out because it's gonna feel like a fantasy. It's not gonna feel real enough to them. The third element here is that we also want it to be documented. So it helps to have it written down so that we can go back to it. We can hold ourselves accountable, right? In some instances, the vision will actually tell us what we're not going to do, right? So it allows us to kind of say, like, sure, that does sound like a great addition, and it's not really a part of this change. Like, if you want to make that change, like start your own VLC. I mean, we would say it a nicer way than that. The other piece of this too, having it documented means that it can also be then communicated. So part of this process is getting it out of the head of the change leader and sharing that picture of what the change is going to look like to get other people on board. So it's not enough just to know in your heart of hearts that change is needed. You need to be able to tell other people why and what your preferred future, what it's going to look like on the other side. And I will say this was also a really major theme from your answers, right? About when a change has gone well, what made it successful, communication, right? Between the compelling reasons and the vision, this is a key way to communicate the change, right? So part of this too, building your vision, writing your vision, is it's not just up to the change leader. I think it's also really helpful to get your ACEs involved. So here, ACE stands for Advisory Content Experts. These are people who may or may not be a part of your organization, but they have a perspective or an experience that is relevant to your change. So they're a great resource when you're working on your vision and your compelling reasons. They can help you strengthen them or bolster them, or they can frankly tell you sometimes that like what you are thinking is not actually reasonable. I mean, they can give you the benefit of their experience. And part of the point that the communication is so important here is that we still need to manage the second part of the step, which is to get leadership agreement, right? You can have the most amazing vision in the world, but if you aren't getting the leader on board, it is not moving forward, right? So this is a tipping point in the decision-making style to get leadership agreement on the vision and the change. If you don't get leadership agreement here, the process stops. And this is something that people, I think, can have a hard time with at the beginning here at Zingerman's. They think that if they do the works on steps 1 and 2, they're good to go. Not so fast. If the leader is not on board, then the change isn't going to happen, right? That was another major theme from your responses, right? That we didn't, like, they didn't get leadership buy-in, they didn't get leadership agreement, and it made people more resistant, and the change wasn't effective because they didn't roll it out well. So it's helpful to know here, we defined 4 different decision-making styles, right? As you're thinking about getting leadership agreement, what are they? And then we'll talk a little bit more about what you do with that information. So first up, in no particular order, we start with a command decision, right? This is when the leader makes a decision, usually pretty unilaterally. The style is useful when we are rolling out a new regulation, right? The government says we need to do something differently. That is not up for discussion. That's a command decision, right? We don't really have a say in that, right? There might be other things, a command decision. Ari at one point wanted to make a change around, in our literature, he talks about what his favorite bread is. And for a really long time, Ari's favorite bread was the farm bread. Which is great, it's delicious. But then he realized that was not actually true anymore. What his favorite bread was our Roadhouse rye, right? Made with 3 different grains. And so he kind of like jokingly started to do a bottom line change process. And, but it's his favorite bread. Like, who's going to be resistant to him stating his preference? That was essentially a command decision, but he still needed to get other people on board, right? What I think he didn't factor in is the long lead times we have of some of our print materials. So the change, it wasn't going to just be an immediate change. We can change it on the website. Boom, it's done. Everyone now knows that Ari's favorite bread is the Roadhouse bread, right? It needed to be something that had a little bit longer of a rollout than he initially anticipated, but it wasn't really up for discussion what his favorite bread was, right? No one gets to tell Ari, like, farm bread. It's not actually your favorite, right? No, that's his decision. Now, if he was going to like solicit input on that and consider it when he's determining what his favorite bread is, that would be more like a consultative decision. So at the end of the day, the decision is the leaders, but they're going to seek input and feedback from the people involved in the change. And I will say, for it to truly be consultative, you need to not have your mind made up in advance. They need to really factor in other people's thoughts and opinions and consider it as you're making a decision. If you are like, oh, I would love to hear your feedback, but I already know what I'm going to do, that's actually a command decision in disguise, and it doesn't feel very good. The third decision-making style here is consensus, which is essentially that the group would work to come to agreement on the final decision, right? Are we going to do this? Or are we not going to do this? And there are different definitions of consensus. It's not necessarily just 100% agreement. It is more, we have a definition here that we need to get to 80% agreement or 80% willing to support the decision. No, wait, hold on. 80% in agreement with the wording and kind of the content, and then 100% willing to support the vision. Right? Or you need to come with a really strong counter proposal. So, just know that there are different definitions of consensus. It does not necessarily mean we need to all be 100% in accord with each other. And then lastly, there's delegation. So with delegation, the decision leaves the end decision in the hands of someone else. So like consultative, if the leader ceding the decision to someone else making the decision, but then they want to kind of they have to truly hand it off. They cannot yank the reins of the decision-making back or second guess it, then you're back to a command decision. And it actually feels worse for the person who had the decision delegated to them when the leader does that. So with delegation, I might say to Katie and say hey, I'd really like you to do a little bit more research on this. I've narrowed it down to these 3 options. Whichever one you decide, I'm going to be 100% okay with, but I would like to leave the final decision in your hands. And then I need to be great with whatever she chooses. And of course I would be. Katie's great. I think it's also really helpful to know upfront the decision-making style, right? It will help you write the vision and compelling reasons, because if it's a single decision maker, you can factor in what you know about that person and what they find to be compelling, or what's important to them. If you are not sure who's going to have the final say, right? If it needs to go, like we work with some really large organizations, we're not that big and we're pretty flat organizationally. If it's like your boss's boss, it's just helpful to know that as you're going through this process. So step 1 and step 2, right? Writing the vision, getting leadership agreement. Once we've done this, the decision has been made. Now we're moving forward. There are times that this change process stops here, right? People write a great vision, they write compelling reasons, they invest a lot of their time and resources, but because they didn't get leadership agreement, it's not going anywhere. And that's really frustrating. So now we've made the change though, we got the support, we're moving ahead with it. And step 3 is an important one, which is to engage a microcosm to determine who else needs to know and how are we going to get the information out. And I will say too, the steps start to go really fast here because with BLC, a lot of the work is front loaded. Right. So we want to get into the microcosm where we kind of I think of it as we check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. Right. You've been thinking about the change for a long time. Your leader is on board. Your ACEs have given you good feedback, but not everyone knows about this change. They don't know it's coming. So what is the best way to get that information out to everyone else? And there's no easy answer, right? It's often the case that we know how to communicate the change to people who are like us, i.e. if you work in sales, you know how to talk to other salespeople. If you work in production, you know how to talk to other people in production. But if I'm in sales, I may not know best how to communicate with the people in production. So if we only communicate in the ways that we are the most comfortable communicating in, or we think that because I like it this way, everyone likes it this way, we're missing out on a lot of other people who may also need to know about the change. Right. So this step about forming a microcosm, or how we define it, is a cross section of kind of the organizational life, right? Or representative sample, a small subset of the whole. Then we're asking them to help us create the communication plan, right? So we want to choose representatives from all of the different groups that are going to be impacted by the change. So we like to think of opposites when we're choosing our microcosm. So if we ask someone in sales, then we would also ask someone in production. We want to ask someone who's worked here for a long time and someone who's worked here for a relatively short time. We want to work, someone who works on the day shift, someone who works on the night shift, right? Front of the house, back of the house, different levels of seniority, right? The goal is to have at least one person kind of representing each group of people who are going to be impacted by the change, and ask them how to best communicate to others like them. So this helps us ensure that we don't miss out on telling anyone about the change, right? I would say that when you're casting your net for the microcosm, it's almost always better to go a little bit bigger or broader than you think you need to, right? I mean, because also not everyone's going to respond to you. And you will find just sometimes surprising ways that people want to get information, right? I wouldn't personally not really care to be texted about a change, but for some people that is the best way to get in touch with them, right? So the first step, as we're doing this, we're creating a communication plan. And I want to be clear, we are not asking for feedback on the vision, right? We are not asking if they think it's, or if they think it's a good idea that we're making this change. This was something I did not understand when I first learned about this. And I would get asked to participate on a microcosm, but I would give feedback on the vision because I didn't necessarily understand that that wasn't what I was getting asked. I was like, well, you sent me the vision and you didn't ask, but I have thoughts, right? That's really not the role here. That's not what we're asking people to do. What we're asking them 2 questions and 2 questions only to help us create the communication plan, which are who else needs to know about the change and how should we tell them? Right. So I want to be clear too, this is something that often gets confused. ACEs and the microcosm are 2 different groups. They have 2 different purposes. So the ACEs are about content expertise, right? About helping with the vision. They could sometimes help with the implementation. The microcosm is about cultural expertise. So they can help really identify who are the key groups of people that really need to know about this change and what are some like interesting or innovative or creative ways to communicate that with them. And one thing that I really love is that often customers come up when we're talking about price changes. And it is a great thing to let customers know in advance about a price change and then to share your compelling reasons with them. It's not just that we want to make more money, but I remember very vividly when the cost of wheat went up pretty significantly about like, I think 8 or 9 years ago. The bakehouse held off on making the change for a while to see if the price of wheat was going to come back down. What someone suggested as a way to communicate with the customers, right, was they actually stacked on the wall the different bags of wheat with the price, right, to show the customers like this much wheat in 2 years ago cost this much. Now it costs this much. So we're incrementally raising the price of our bread because like we held off as long as we could, but like it was a pretty big difference that was very visual and customers could really understand, right? The people who are rolling out the change are like, well, we're just going to update our prices and then we'll tell them and then they'll pay for it or they won't, right? But that creativity, I think, really helped the customers, some of their resistance to paying higher prices. They understood more about why it was necessary. So, I mean, there's a lot of creativity that people in different positions can bring to bear on this. And I think they give you great insight. I would also say here too, that step 3 can feel like a relatively insignificant step or one that we could skip. We've tried to skip it in the past, but we like to compare this step to like the baking soda in a recipe for biscuits, right? If you're a baker or if you've made biscuits before, you may have an idea of what we're getting at. When you think about all of the ingredients you need to make biscuits, it's relatively simple, but the amount of baking soda you include in that total recipe is a tiny percentage, right? It's maybe a teaspoon, right? Or like 2% of the total recipe. But if you don't include the baking soda in your recipe, you end up with hockey pucks, right? The biscuits don't rise and you do not get the results that you want. I think this is very much like the role that the microcosm plays, right? If we don't use it, the step seems small, but we're going to have increased resistance and we're not going to get a change that sticks if we try to skip this step. Okay, so now that we have this information, we want to move into step 4. It is finally time to tell everyone about the change using all the work that we've done in steps 1 through 3 and officially create an action plan to roll out the change. So the change leader's role in this, really, it is a critical role in the success of a change. And step 4 really, I think, often involves bringing a group of people together who you want their help in rolling out the change. You typically call a meeting with those who are going to be involved, right? Or announce this in a meeting that's already been scheduled, and then tell them why you're seeking their help, right? You want their opinions, you want their thoughts, and frankly, you're going to probably want them to take some actions. As the change leader, now is when I'm going to formally share the compelling reasons and the vision. And often we'll put quotes in front of officially shared the vision because people may have seen it before, but it stops changing, right? Once we've gotten past step 2, we may have done multiple additions or, we've edited the vision. Now this is the final draft. We're not changing it anymore, right? So we want to roll that out. We also want to communicate what are the results from the microcosm? What did we hear? Who did they think needs to know? And how did they suggest we're going to tell people? And we want to go back to our first steps. What are the action steps that have already been identified? So once we've done the work of sharing, the progress or process so far, we want to turn to the people in the meeting and ask them, like, what questions of clarification do they have? right? So that they're all on the same page. We're all clear about what the change will be. And then we work together to figure out what do we need in order to actually implement the change. So, one important question that usually needs to get answered is, when is the change going to officially happen? When does it go live, right? What, if anything, needs to be purchased? Who's going to write the new SOP, right? Or standard operating procedure? Who's responsible for changing the website or updating the voicemail, right? These are all a lot of things that, like, there's all these nitty-gritty details that you've been thinking about this change for so long that may have totally escaped your mind. The other thing too is a great place to document questions for people who weren't there, right? So creating your own FAQs or frequently asked questions to share with other people, and creating an FAQ for your customers too. So this is a step that helps you really roll this out to the other people in your organization to make it kind of official, right? And you may be a small organization, so that maybe everyone is involved in this process. But if you're in like 100-person organization, this might be a small group of 10, right? That you're kind of like formally rolling this out to, and then it's going to get rolled out further on that. And I think in a lot of organizations, the action plan is set by the key leaders or the owners in a closed room, and then it's kind of like told to everyone else. And very often the people who are actually going to be implementing the change aren't consulted in forming the action plan, right? And so like there are some really obvious things that like they would know to add to the action plan, but someone who's like 3 or 4 steps removed just wouldn't occur to them. So this way, by having the right people in the room, right, kind of like involving people in the process, we, for one, this is another way of helping to outweigh resistance and get buy-in. And we don't want to overlook anything that would be really helpful in actually making the change, right? The more people we have involved, and people want to get involved and have a voice in the process, right? When they feel like this is something they've been excluded from, they get more resistant. Another thing that I want to say too, and I've referenced this a little bit, if you get to this step, right, and people have asked you questions along the way, right? About like, well, what about this? And what about this? You can document those and bring that to this meeting to say, here are some of the thoughts that people had at different points in the process. Here was, when I was sharing the compelling reasons, this was a great first step that someone thought of, right? Let's make sure that that's a part of the action plan. That really helps people feel seen and heard, right? That they had this idea and that you didn't just like, wash over it or forget about it. So now that we've done this work, now that we have an action plan of actually rolling out the change, now we get into step 5, which is to implement the change, right? So if you're about to like go live with the change and people are rolling their eyes a little bit and like, haven't we done this already? Man, that validates the work that you've done in steps 1 through 4, right? You've done the steps well. So people already know the change is happening and they're ready for the change to be put into place. And so we use the Deming cycle here, which is to plan, do, check, and adjust, right? Plan, that's step 4. We've already done that work. To the do is to actually go live with the change. All the work and all the previous steps have prepared us for it. And now this is where the change is officially made. Then we also want to build in checks as the change goes live. People are often more willing to go along with a change if they know that we're going to have that check so that their opinions, their thoughts, there are opportunities for providing feedback that are just built in, right? It could be done at a weekly meeting, could be done at like a standing meeting, or we could have a special meeting like, a couple of weeks after something started. Because inevitably we get to the A, we're going to need to adjust. There are always going to be unforeseen things that we couldn't have planned for. So we want to just be really clear. We are going to check on this. We want your feedback. We're going to need to make adjustments, right? And then we're going to go through the cycle again. And at Zingerman's, we added 2 steps as, on behalf of Stosh. One of them is to celebrate, right? Change can be really hard. When you let a change process and the change has been successfully implemented, just take a minute to reflect on all the hard work that went into that, do a round of high fives, right? Let's celebrate. We're on the other side of this, worked the way we thought it was going to work. Isn't that exciting, right? And then the last one is to document, how did the change go? What did you like best from the rollout? Is there anything that we could do differently the next time? So documenting what you learned from the rollout will help you more effectively roll out change in the future, right? So just putting it all out there. So I've now gone through the entire change process, right? Steps 1 through 5. You can see a little bit more clearly how often change is done in the reverse order. I would also say too, I think of this as an iterative process. So it isn't like you create your clear and compelling reasons for change, you're done, moving on. No, this is where we go back to the change formula, where sometimes we need to improve them. They need to be more compelling. We need to think about different constituencies. Oh, we forgot that like we need to have a compelling reason that's going to get the person with the purse strings to kind of like loosen their wallet a little bit. The vision might go through a couple of rounds of editing, especially getting feedback from the leader before they're willing to approve it and move forward with the change. The microcosm, and again, steps 1 and 2, we might need to go back and forth around a little bit before we get to step 3. And I said the purpose of step 3 is not to get feedback from people, right? I mean, at that point, the vision should be pretty much final. Doesn't mean that people don't give you the unsolicited feedback and that it isn't sometimes really good. So you can, factor things in a little bit. By step 4, though, you really want it to stop changing, right? We often keep the word draft on a vision for a really long time, even after it's official. But I think that step 4 is when you would want to take the word draft off the vision. So I've gone through the whole process. This is pretty intense. So I know that questions have been coming in, and I want to give you a chance to answer, I want to give you a chance to ask the questions that I will then answer. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides here and see what do folks want to know?
Hello, I'm going to rejoin you too, Elmian. I'll be the voice of our audience.
Great.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come through. And if you have more as we're conversing over the next 10 minutes or so, please just keep populating that Q&A, and we have our eyes on it. So the first step is a little technical, but just so that we all have the same understanding of those 5 steps, Billy has asked for clarification on step 4. So wondering if you already have the action plan in place and you're communicating it in step 4, or if you're asking the group for feedback on the action plan, or the both.
You're actually asking the group to help you create the action plan, right? This is where, like, if you come to people and here are all the things I want you to do in order to roll out this change, people are going to be like, you don't say, right? That doesn't increase their buy-in. But asking them, like, this is a change we need to make. Here are some of the steps that I thought might be necessary. What else do we need to do? Like, you're asking them to help you collectively create the action plan. It is not something that you have pre-done before you go into that meeting.
Thank you. Okay, I think that will clarify very much. Another question is, this is sort of, how do you get leaders on board? So say your entire team is behind a better process for change, but how do you get a leader on board to be part of the change?
Oof. I mean, so no one's going to like this answer. It depends. It depends on the change. It depends on your leader. I do think that, especially if you know that there is enthusiasm around from a lot of people on your team for making a change, communicating that with the leader, and saying, like, or the other thing too, that, we use lean, right? And continuous improvement here at Zingerman's. I think that bottom line change and lean go very much hand in hand. So you could ask, like, this is the change we want to make. This is what we want the end outcome to be. Would you be willing for us to run some experiments, right? Can we try something a little bit different? So then it's not like we're making a permanent change. We have to do everything differently forever and ever. It's more we would like to do this for a little while. We would like to see if this might be more effective. And I mean, depending on the scope of the change, that might not be feasible. But I think that is another way to kind of get a leader on board, that it isn't like, I'm asking you to approve something that's going to be different for the rest of all time. So yeah, I mean, finding what they find compelling and then putting those in your compelling reasons does help a lot.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. On the flip side, there's a couple questions. Eric and Doug have both asked something similar about how long it takes to implement bottom line change in an organization, like throughout, as opposed to maybe just a small group of people who are really into the idea. And then this ties into, like, do you teach change before you navigate the first process? Might you go about implementing this?
Okay, so I mean, they're two different questions. One, we do teach change to people, and that's one of the things I love hearing the stories that happen at Zingerman's, where there is a formal class, but sometimes someone who is relatively new will be like, I really think that this should be better. Can we just make this change? And then someone who's been at Zingerman's for a little bit longer will say like, hey, we have a process for that, right? Bottom line change really helps with kind of like, I think of them as the idea gift givers / bomb droppers, the people who want to give you the gift of a really great idea that you then implement. Asking them to create compelling reasons and a vision of the change tells you who's serious about doing it or not. So teaching this as broadly as you can and giving them the process, and then being willing as a leader to coach them through it, I think is a really good place to start. I also think the length of time it takes to make a change really depends on the scale of your change. I remember when our former HR director, Patty, wanted to change the name of the department from HR to Department for People. That took a solid 1.5 years to the point where, and like I knew about it at the very inception of the idea, right? She had that kernel of an idea in one of our seminars, but then, you know, 1+ year later, I was like, God, are we still talking about this? Is this done yet? Right. But that's because I knew about it for a lot longer than other people, but it was a pretty big change, right? Like, you know, so that took, I think I would say, a solid 1.5 years. But by the time the change actually was what happened, there was no resistance to it. People were like, can we just do it and get on with our lives? Right. I mean, so, you know, I think it really depends on the scale of your change. I will also say that if you are someone who likes to make change really fast, right, as a lot of innovators and entrepreneurs do, this will be slower than you want it to be in upfront, but the change will be more effective on the other side, right? That's the kind of the trade-off for it, is that you're gonna not have as much griping about it when the change officially happens. People are gonna do it.
Thank you.
Good questions. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a different style of implementation.
Okay.
What would be recommended if you've made a change without doing this process, without the soft rollout and build up? Is it salvageable to backtrack?
Yes. You can do BLC retroactively, right? So, I mean, it's one of the things that, like, especially people who work in really large organizations will say, things come down from on high. I need to then translate it to my team. I use bottom line change for that. And I'm kind of think, what's the risk? I mean, one of the compelling reasons is we have to. I mean, that's probably not as compelling for people, but it is a reason that exists. And it kind of sometimes comes down to like, if you want to keep your job, if we want to continue getting funding, this is the change we're going to make. So then you as the leader is essentially creating the vision for the future that you didn't get from your leaders, right? But it makes you a more effective leader for the people that are kind of within your sphere of influence. So you can absolutely do bottom line change retroactively, and you can do it for changes that you did not make any decisions about.
Sorry, I'm looking at two different screens in a moment. So Sarah says, Eleni, a great session. What would you recommend for additional reading on this topic?
Well, we do. So we do have a pamphlet that Ari wrote about the bottom line change process that's on our website. You can purchase it. We have blog posts about different parts of the change process. We have a virtual live workshop that is 2.5 hours that gives you, so some of the content would be the same, but it gives you time to actually work on a change as you go through it and get feedback from the other people in the workshop who don't have a stake in the outcome of your change. I would say, I mean, those are really, I think, the biggest resources. We have a toolkit that is launching this summer with a special bottom line change tune-up that will be Wednesdays in June that I think is launching in the next month or so. So you can keep an eye out for that. But I think those are the big resources that come to mind.
Yeah. And I can speak just slightly more. I was going to announce it at the end of the webinar, but we're basically there.
I was like, did I get it right?
You did, yeah. So we are getting ready to launch a new on-demand training that walks people through the bottom line change process. It's a tool you would buy and you would have access to it forever. But in this launch that we're doing, it's going to be packaged with weekly live sessions so that you can learn from other people who are going through the course and also talk with trainers to dive deeper into certain areas and walk through walk and be guided through an organizational change of your own over the course of a month. And that month will be June. So it's an exciting thing. There'll be a link if you want to know about it as soon as we launch it in the follow-up email today. Yeah, so that's just another resource. There's people learn in different ways. And so we want to give people as many options as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And like maybe one last question, is there, Katie?
Yes, there is. So if the change is only a so-so idea and really can't be implemented, is there good language that a leader can use to?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I do think it is really kind coaching, right? It is like essentially, what would it take for this to be a compelling reason? Is there the germ of a good idea in there? And can you help them kind of like flesh it out and get to more compelling reasons, or help them get to the point where they realize that it's only a so-so idea without you explicitly saying that, right? Like, well, let's talk about the compelling reasons. And you as the leader saying, well, what would it take for it to be compelling enough for me to approve this to go forward? I think that can be really helpful too. And it's just, that's a fabulous coaching for that trainee or the employee to get to do more effective change. I know we're right at time. I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for all of your great participation. Please do ask us questions. I know Katie's going to send a follow-up email with a recording and the slides, but we love to see what you create. Also, send us your changes. We'd love to see them.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Thank you, Elnian, for sharing your time, Mara for doing all of the back of house stuff. We are going to send a follow-up email with the recording, with a couple of additional resources, and then also a feedback link. We would love to hear feedback. It directly impacts what we do here in our webinars and at ZingTrain. So thank you so much, and we'll hope to see you back here soon.
All right, thanks everyone.